welcome to Fixing Ignorance, a new podcast opening conversation on the big political, psychological and philosophical questions of our time. My name is Jake Bonetta, and I will be the host of this podcast series. Each episode, I will be joined by a few guests, my friends and colleagues, talking about facts and our opinions on massive, serious and thought-provoking issues in a more relaxed setting than a debate. Today, we will be talking about a rather controversial topic, religion. Specifically, whether religion has been a force for good in the world. However, before we get started on that, I am joined today by Noah Bodley Scott, Harry Long and Emily Kelly. Why don't you guys introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about you.
Hey, I'm Noah Bodley Scott. I have been studying maths, physics and music. I am not particularly qualified to talk about this issue other than that I have thought about it a lot, and I guess my religious background is probably worth stating. So I was raised going to Catholic church, although it was a particularly liberal Catholic congregation, and my parents are... I would say they're not Catholics, despite the fact they go to Catholic church. Ideologically, I don't think they're very similar to Catholics. And I stopped being a Catholic. I am now, I guess I could accurately describe myself as an atheist. I don't know how much of that baggage I want to carry, but whatever. So yeah, I have been religious and am now not.
Hello, I'm Harry Long. I studied RE as one of my A-levels, a decision which some have questioned, including myself, but perhaps that means I am extremely qualified to talk on these matters. I'm hoping to study Arabic and Islamic studies at university. As for my religious background, I was raised in the Anglican tradition. Now I might want to describe myself as an agnostic Christian or a Christian agnostic, which might seem a bit of a contradiction in terms, and it is, but I suppose I'm not sure what I believe about God. But I feel comfortable in the tradition of Christianity, just about anyway.
Hi, I'm Emily Kelly. I studied English, History and RE at A-level, and I'm hopefully going on to study Theology and Religion at university. I wasn't raised Christian, but I've been Christian for most of my life. But now I would describe myself as agnostic.
Okay, brilliant. Unfortunately, my friend Ted Williams was unable to make it today. However, Ted has kindly sent in some of his thoughts on the subject. A practicing Quaker, Ted has a deep interest in the ways the legal and political systems work worldwide. We will talk about his thoughts later on. I will be taking more of a back seat in this debate to make sure that everyone has the chance to fully get their points across. So, the concept of religion is that of a socio-cultural system of morals, teachings and ethics that relate to the ultimate goal of humanity, whether that be reaching oneness with God or Allah in Christianity and Islam, or escaping the cycle of reincarnation into nirvana or moksha in Buddhism or Hinduism. The common goal of a religion often serves as the building blocks for the community it creates. Early evidence of religions and religious rituals date back 300,000 years, and as such, a 2012 global study by Pew Research Center found that 84% of the world's population is affiliated to a religion, with only 16% unaffiliated from any faith. Religion has been a large pillar of human society for thousands of years, but has been damaged and faded slightly in recent years with various revelations of historic corruption and with the rise of atheism. So, to start off with, I think we should talk about why religion could be seen as bad. Take it away, Noah.
I'd say the most obvious examples of religion being a force for bad in the world are those of religious extremism, and I guess that's when violent groups are justifying their actions through religion. Now, I suppose that plenty of people would make the argument that they are poor representatives of their faith, and I think that is accurate to a point. However, if the core text of an ideology, and I guess in most cases I mean text literally, if the core text of an ideology is being used in that way, I would argue that that does reflect badly on the ideology as a whole. And I would say that it's not true to say that every ideology or religion is equally susceptible to being manipulated in that way. And I think some texts leave themselves more or less open to that kind of abuse.
Well, I think that while religion can certainly be used as a tool with respect to creating conflict or justifying conflict, it can be used as a tool in much the same way that any other ideology could be used in its place. So, for example, in his book, Does Religion Do More Harm Than Good?, Rupert Short talks about how a lot of modern terrorism is rooted primarily in Marxism. And I think modern secular ideologies often have equally violent histories or applications to religious ideologies. So I think that perhaps where religion is used to justify things, it could just as easily be something else if religion wasn't present. And so it's not useful to say that religion is necessarily harmful as much as it would be to say that any human ideology could potentially be harmful.
I was just interested in that point about, I don't know whether you said many or most, but like extremism being inspired by Marxism. Could you elaborate on that a bit more? That's not something I've come across before.
Well, perhaps to say most extremism might be an exaggeration, but certainly a lot of modern extremism is rooted in one way or another in modern ideologies just as much as old ones.
The IRA, they were influenced by Marxism. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they're not a terrorism anymore, they're the regime, but they're Marxist influences there as well. But I think both what Noah said and what Emily said has a lot of truth in it. But I think, if you take something like fanaticism, like Emily said, that can be applied to anything, whether that be a political ideology or a religious ideology. But I think there's fertile ground in religion for fanaticism to take hold, because so often a religion claims to be the absolute truth, that a religion claims to have the exclusive claim to the right God or the right way of living. And so that it's quite easy to see how that can lead to conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see where you're coming from with that argument. Absolutely, Harry. I just wanted to butt in quickly with something that Ted said to me before the podcast. Obviously, he couldn't make it today, but as a Quaker, I thought it'd be quite interesting to hear his side of the argument. And he said along these lines that religion is, at the end of the day, a belief or a person's willingness to believe in something. If you replace religion, the individual will always find something else to believe in, like a political ideology or an atheistic dogma. Therefore, Ted thinks it's important to say that beliefs are like science and talent, in that objectively they are neither good nor bad. So I think he can pretty much agree with you in terms of a political ideology being a forefront for terrorism in that respect. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say there. Noah.
I don't think it's quite true to say that people are inclined to be ideological, therefore you cannot make value judgments about ideologies. I completely agree with Ted that belief is necessary for people to function. We physically do not have the time or the processing power in our brains to understand in depth even just the things that are directly influential to our daily lives, let alone the universe at large. However, just because ideology is necessary doesn't mean all ideologies were created equal, and I think it's perfectly valid to compare them and make value judgments, and I think you can reasonably say that some ideologies are better than others.
Yeah, I think what Noah just said there had a lot going for it. I think I broadly agree with Ted that religion, because obviously the title of this is just talking quite an abstract way about religion rather than specific religions. Religion is such a vast thing. It's so complex. There are so many different types of religions, so many denominations within religions, that to say religion as a whole has had a net impact that is bad or good doesn't really make sense. But when you're looking at an individual religion or ideology, analysis probably becomes a bit easier. But ultimately, I think that religion is something that humans do. It's something that arises in human society, and humans have the capacity for good and bad, and religion is necessarily going to be the same.
I kind of agreed with Harry a lot on that, to be honest, that I think that religion is something that can be used for either good or bad. And I think I'd go even further and say that you can compare religions, whereas you can't necessarily evaluate religion as a concept. You can compare religions, but I think even that is a difficult thing to do because there's so much variety in any religion. So you have, fundamentalism on the one end, and a much more liberal approach on the other end. And so even to evaluate whether Christianity is good or Islam is good, it's such a broad thing that it's very difficult to do.
There's so much duality in religion because the same force of belief, the same fervour that can make people so intolerant can make them so energetic in trying to live a life that they think is right, which can lead them to be more altruistic.
And it doesn't really go on from that, but from what we were saying before about evaluating religions, I think it's fair to say that the good or badness of a religion changes quite significantly over the course of its history, and plenty of the popular religions currently are very, very old, and at different points in their history, they have had better and worse effects on the world around them. And also, as I was talking about texts earlier, but I'm going to go back to that, about the texts surrounding them. So like stuff like the Islamic religious texts and the Christian religious texts are like they're masses of collected works without, I guess I'm coming from the presupposition that God doesn't exist. So I'm going to say that they don't have any unifying direction necessarily. The people writing the various bits might have been motivated by the same ideas, but ultimately they were all different people writing at very different times. And so the message after however many thousands of years tends to come out a bit messy. And I think that might be one way in which the religions can be turned into a force for bad.
I was just going to say, going on from what Noah said, really, I think he was making a very good point that the broadness of a lot of religious texts means that they can be interpreted in so many different ways. So, for example, with the Bible, there are, 4 different versions of the Gospels. And so anyone can pick whichever version of the Gospels, for whatever they're trying to evidence. You could potentially pick any version of the Gospels which evidences that and ignore other things. But I think the same is true of an awful lot of things in life. With science, for example, you can place emphasis on one aspect of science and not on another. And there's often, in a lot of areas, there's not always as much certainty as people think. And so I don't think that that's something that's necessarily unique to religion. I think it's something that is true of all kinds of different walks of life.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, actually. I agree with you there in the fact that religions can mention and say completely different things within the same text. For example, you mentioned in Christianity, the 4 Gospels. You've also got Genesis, the 2 different stories of Genesis talking about completely different things. One talking about the dominion of the earth, power over the earth, and one talking about stewardship, looking after the earth and making sure it's there for future generations. So it's definitely a very interesting thing to look at, I think. Noah.
On Emily's comparison to science, I don't think that's quite fair, because science has a built-in mechanism for consensus, effectively. Admittedly, while theories are being tested, there might be a variety of ideas, but you very rarely get the situation where 2 mutually exclusive points are kind of bashing into each other like they do with religious text. Because, as Harry was talking about this earlier, but the idea that whatever religion has the one true word of God or gods or whatever, that tends to create the situation where you can't abandon stuff that you used to think was true and now don't, because that would involve admitting that your text is fallible. Whereas science has, as I say, the built-in mechanism for building consensus and getting rid of old, worse ideas and replacing them with new, better ones.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you there, Noah. I think science obviously continues to evolve, has evolved ever since the invention of literature over 5,000 years ago. But obviously religion, some religious texts were written over 2,000 years ago. Looking at the Old Testament, that was written before Christ, obviously, and That was over 2,000 years ago as we're talking now. Harry, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting talking about, Noah mentioned how science has a system of coming to consensus. And I think religions, certainly in the past, when you had a religious authority, especially like the Catholic Church, for instance, but also the Islamic scholarly consensus, they had methods, almost a science. I think in Islam they are called sciences, the Islamic sciences, of bringing together seemingly disparate content and harmonizing it. And for instance, in Islam, they have a specific method of working out which sayings of the Prophet can be said to be authentic, and they have all sorts of detailed ways of doing that. And it could be that that's a bad thing, because then you have an authority imposing something that's harmful. But what you see in the modern day is that with the rise of the internet, in the Muslim religion, for instance, you have a lot more autonomy, where people, they're able to read the Quran for themselves or the hadiths for themselves and come to your own conclusion. And often you'll find some of these horrific acts perpetrated by ISIS or whoever, which is condemned by the scholarly establishment because it's contrary to the centuries of consensus. But when people start to come to their own conclusions, that can be, and interpret it for themselves, that can be dangerous, or it can be positive. And I think in Christianity, the Reformation, when that sort of thing started happening for Christians, broadly, maybe not in the short term, because there are a lot of wars, but broadly, in the long term, I think that's been a good thing.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point there, actually. Noah, did you have anything to add?
Well, just a quick one in that we've kind of made the dichotomy between religion and science, and Harry was kind of getting at that, but historically, it doesn't exist, and religion was science, and most science was conducted. I don't know if most is necessarily true, but certainly a lot of science was conducted through religious organizations. I don't necessarily think that's a point in religion's favor, though, because I think you might be able to characterize some religion as just a kind of, well, old science that no longer holds up. And that's not to put down the people who were doing it at the time, but I don't think that's justification for supporting it anymore.
Just going back to what you said earlier, Jake, about religious texts and the belief that they're infallible, making it difficult to then go back on what you've previously said that you believe. I think that really depends on the approach that you take to the religious text. So, for example, a lot of modern Christian approaches to the Bible view it much more as a kind of national literature, in a sense, of the people of Israel, certainly in the Old Testament. And in the case of the New Testament, much more as a collection of historical sources on the life of Jesus than necessarily the Word of God. And this enables much more kind of flexibility in belief, because it means that the Bible is seen within its historical context and is able to move forward with the kind of modern times. And I think that means that in the case of certainly in the case of Christians who do believe that the Bible is the Word of God, it is very difficult to remain consistent and go back on your past beliefs without then denying a fundamental tenet of your belief that religious text is the Word of God. But I think with more modern approaches to some religious texts, that can become less of an issue.
Okay, yeah, you raise a very good point there. Noah or Harry, did you have anything to add?
I just wanted to maybe reply to something Noah said about religion being a kind of old, outdated form of science. I think there might be something in that, but
yeah, I'm not entirely. I think yeah. But anyway, keep going.
yeah, but if there is, I think that perhaps would rather be a consequence of people not understanding and then misapplying religion to something that confused them or that they didn't understand. Because people often draw a distinction between religion and science, saying that religion is about why and science is about how and stuff. That sort of distinction. So they don't go together. They don't answer the same questions, and people perhaps have been mistaken in conflating them in the past. But I think generally in the modern day, and not always, as you can see in creationism and the intelligent design movement, they are separated, which is probably a good thing.
I don't know if it is actually particularly useful to make this distinction between the hows and the whys, and I think it is increasingly becoming possible to blur the lines, and the hows kind of make advances on the territory of the whys constantly, as it were. The scientific method can be applied to sociology. Sociology is a science, and you can inform your moral judgments with science. You can construct tools for measuring, I don't know, the impact of an action. So I don't know, like a program of social security or something. If you're working in government, you can construct mechanisms for analyzing it and make a judgment as to whether it is good or bad based on that. I don't think the distinction is necessary, and I actually, in a lot of cases, I don't think it's particularly useful either.
I think you're right that definitely when it comes to looking at evidence and then wanting to know how you move forward, you can look at the different possibilities, the different impacts of a policy, as you said. But I think the value judgment that you have to make, for me, that is something separate from science. I don't know. I'm not sure you could go from one thing to the other.
I would agree with that, to be fair, in that it can never be entirely scientific, because, well, to have a system of values, you have to make some kind of, well, some religious people would argue that it's not arbitrary, but in my view, you have to base any value judgment on some sort of arbitrary presupposition. So that might be utilitarianism or something, which is fair enough. I guess, to refine my point slightly, I would say that the extent to which science is unable to deal in matters of morality is overestimated. I think I think it has significantly more weight in that realm than some people give it credit for.
And that presupposition that you said, that foundational basis for a value judgment, I guess for a lot of people is religion. So I'd say that's how they interrelate. But I think, yeah, we're going away from the point a bit. And just one last thing I'd say about the religion being bad. I think perhaps religion at its very worst is when it's attached to an authority, or it has power, temporal power, worldly power, which it oughtn't have. Like Christianity in its early days, it was a movement among ordinary people who were persecuted at times, and then it became the religion of the empire, and that did a lot of good for Christians, and it's got us to where we are now. But as soon as you have a religion in charge, then things can get a bit nasty, because you can institute inquisitions, you can go to war for religious reasons against other religions, Crusades being one of those examples. So I think it's better to have religion in a more suitable place, which is outside of power, maybe looking in at it, criticizing it, highlighting injustice perhaps, being just something that ordinary people have, but not something that those at the top use. People who want to preserve power and the power of the religion, the status quo.
I think it's a good point that religion at its worst is religion with too much power. But I think at the same time that's more of an issue with absolute power than with religion as a concept. And I think, again, the same could be said of kings or just generally leadership, whether in religion that's moral leadership, with kings that's political leadership, and in religion sometimes it can be blurred. But I think anything with too much power is a negative, and that's not something that's necessarily just an issue with religion so much as it's an issue with power.
Power corrupts, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. Noah, did you have anything to add quickly as a last point before we move on?
I was interested in this idea of power, and I think I don't think you can quite kind of draw a distinction between when religion has power and when religion doesn't. Like, fair enough, when Christianity was small, it had less power because it just had less people, and then when the empire adopted it, fair enough, the leadership was using Christianity, but the leadership's power is supported by its populace. Like, the physical, raw, violent power is mostly about the people and resources you can wield. And I would draw attention to somewhere like America, which is allegedly a secular state, but it is effectively a Christian state I would argue, because a majority of the population, perhaps, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but certainly a majority of like lawmakers are peddling Christian ideologies. So I don't think you can kind of make the distinction between religion with power. I think it's more just like the only way to keep a religion out of power is to keep it small, which if the religion is good, or at least if the ideology is sound, you wouldn't want to do. You'd want it to spread. I don't think a religion having or an ideology having power is necessarily a bad thing. Again, I would just point back to the quality of the ideology itself.
I think what you said is true, but there are different types of power and different types of influence. But I think the one I was thinking of specifically is when a religion becomes the establishment and it loses sight of anything other than just wanting to stay in power, staying at the top, retaining the status quo as it was in the Middle Ages. But I think that's a very fair point you made about the US.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that point quickly. I've just remembered from a politics class, we were talking about religious content of the US Congress specifically. In the current US Congress, there is one unaffiliated person within the US Congress. Basically, there is one person that doesn't affiliate to any religion whatsoever. So there is a massive link in the US, especially to religion within government, but also in the UK. If you look at the House of Lords, for example, we have 26 bishops. Lord Spiritual, that are there and make laws in the UK. They have to vote on our laws. So I think that should finish up the negatives of religion. Now I think we should move on to how you guys think the effects of religion can be seen as good.
I mean, I've kind of said this briefly earlier, but I think it is fair to say that at plenty of points in history, emerging religions, or at least the behavior and ideology that religions condone, is preferable to the prevailing ideology of the time. Yeah, I mean, I already used the example of the culture that Jesus was trying to change. But, and then again, I would add that doesn't mean that the ideas are good forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, religion can be seen as good in many ways. If you look at the advances in human society that have been helped by them, as you've mentioned earlier, in the development of philosophical and ethical thoughts, but also in the development of education worldwide and scientific advancements, especially made in the Middle East before colonialism in Europe took hold. But you could also talk about how religion has expanded human knowledge beyond the world. It has expanded human knowledge to the skies, to gods, to ultimate truths that people wouldn't have thought about if there wasn't these texts to direct them in this way. Emily, did you have anything to add to this?
I would challenge that people wouldn't have thought about these things without religion and religious texts, because I think a lot of philosophy in many ways predates or is at least in some way independent of religion. So if you look at, for example, ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, even though they have influenced religion in a lot of ways, they're largely regarded as secular philosophers. And I think even without the growth of modern religion as it is today, there would still be the pursuit of knowledge, because I think that's a fundamental part of human nature, to want to know more about the world, whether that's coming from a religious standpoint or not.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. But obviously, you could take the counter argument that Aristotle influenced Thomas Aquinas, who wrote Natural Moral Law, which is very, very influential in the Catholic Church in the modern day. Noah.
Yeah, to build on Emily's point, I think it's important to say that since plenty of civilizations have been religiously dominated in their hierarchies for a lot of history, it would be easy to kind of confuse or conflate every scientific advancement that a society makes and say that and credit it to religion just because it happened to happen in a religious society, and that's obviously not true. But I think that mistake gets made sometimes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I think the societies themselves and their riches especially are what brought about those developments. I don't think the religion necessarily links to that, obviously, because, and I will use the example of the switch between the Middle East and Islamic settlements as the hub for science to Europe and Christian settlements in the 1400s, 1500s. As an example for that, scientific advancement isn't stuck to religion. However, you could use the argument that in Islam, and I know Harry and Emily will know a little bit about this, Al-Ghazali, a famous philosopher within Islam, did catalyze the fall of science, the fall of the Islamic Golden Age, through his fundamental beliefs in Islam. But yeah, religions can be seen in many ways as positive. You can obviously look at the different ways the organizations within religion help people, for example, through charity, obviously charity being one of the 5 pillars in Islam. But you can also look at how organized religion helps people in their everyday lives. Harry, did you have anything to add?
I think there is something in the idea that religion has helped with the development of science and philosophy. Science, for instance, religious people began to study the world expecting to find some kind of order because they believed that God had made the universe in an ordered way, and they wanted to study it because they wanted to better understand God. And I think that's fair. That's a fair point to make. Whether it would have happened otherwise is another matter. I think it probably would. It would have, maybe later. But I think for me, from my perspective, the biggest positive that religion has is just its impact on just ordinary religious people, giving them meaning in particular, because so often the world can seem so meaningless, and it can be hard not to get bogged down with difficulties, with mundane things, and having hope in a world that seems hopeless, meaning in a world that seems meaningless, something to cling on to, a reason to get up in the morning, something to keep their mind focused on when things are hard, and a sense of, well, in many cases, a sense of relationship, a sense of unconditional love. All of that, I think it is really very special. It's not something I feel I have in quite the same way as other religious people I've met, but I really do see something quite special there, and I can respect that and value it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Noah and Emily, you want to speak, but just before you do, I wanted to butt in with a little bit of a research that I'd found. There was a study done in the USA of around 8,500 people in the 1990s. And these researchers followed these people between the ages of 40 and 90, or more than 90, for more than 8 years, noting those who passed away of any cause. And the results revealed there was an 18% reduction in the risk of dying during this period for people who attended church services once a week, and a 30% reduction for those attending more than once a week. So I think that really shows that there is some sort of correlation between positive physical and spiritual health, and also the lives that people want to live. Noah and Emily, did you have anything to add to this conversation?
So I just wanted to add that I think a few observations about the role of religion in the current coronavirus pandemic and the way that that's kind of shown religion at its best in a number of ways. Because I think particularly for aging populations, things like religions providing a sense of community which can now be transferred online in the forms of, for example, there have been Bible conferences hosted online, and churches ensuring that their members have, a continued sense of community, can be really useful, particularly for the elderly people within the congregations, to make sure that they're not feeling quite so isolated at the moment. And I think more generally for elderly people, religion can be particularly useful because of the kind of traditions and the framework and the community that it provides. Can give a kind of, at its best, a complete way of living your life and a complete sense of community, which can be very helpful kind of emotionally and mentally.
Okay, yeah. Noah?
There's a couple of things, got to try and remember them. What period did you say those statistics were from again, Jake? Sorry, I missed that.
It was the early 1990s.
Yeah, okay. In the early 1990s, I mean, I haven't done my own research on this, but I might hypothesize that there might be a correlation between church-going people and other factors that affect people's health. So correlation, but I think there's quite a lot more research to be done to prove causation. Secondly, on the stuff that Harry and Emily have been saying about the benefits of religion, those are undeniably benefits, but I think they're benefits of religion and ideology more broadly. And I don't think it's fair to pin them on any of the religions that currently exist and use it as, I don't know whether you're implicitly making this argument, but I know that some people do, in that they point to the emotional and mental health based benefits of religion, or even the benefits based on charitable giving and that sort of thing. And just because people are motivated to do that doesn't mean that the ideology that's motivating them to do that is the best ideology, or that holistically the ideology is particularly any good. Charity-wise, I think plenty of the charitable endeavours of religion could be much more effectively achieved through something like socialism. Or I think governments can do a better job of filling those needs than any charity can. And people need purpose in their lives, and sometimes something religious or ideological might be the way to achieve that, but that isn't an argument for any particular religion, and probably not, maybe for the ones that currently exist, but I don't think necessarily.
Okay, that's a very interesting point, actually, I think. Emily, did you have anything to say about that?
I had two little things to say, if that's all right. The first one is that I agree that many of the mental health benefits currently from religion could well be achieved in other ways. But I think that at the moment, religion is in many ways one of the best placed things to provide that, simply because of its age and the kind of the wide amount of traditions and kind of frameworks that it offers and that have developed over thousands of years. Because of that, it can provide an extremely comprehensive guide to living your life and guide to meaning compared to something newer. And I think in terms of religion and charity, I think Noah made a really good point, and I think a good example of where religion can go against doing better things for the world or for charity is in American apocalypticism, where they believe that because the apocalypse is on the way, it would be against God's will to in any way try and improve the world. And so they don't believe that we should be striving for peace in its most extreme forms. They don't believe that we should be striving for peace and security, because rather we should be trying to bring on the end of the world through instability. And I think that's an example of how religion can cause, at its worst, can sometimes cause political inertia and the kind of ability to ignore very big issues like global warming.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Noah?
On the point that religion is well placed to provide for people because of its age, I would strongly disagree with that. I think that its age is especially nowadays, is keeping it very conservative, or not religion as a whole, but the established religions tend to be conservative forces in politics and advocate for less liberal, and I would argue worse, ways of going about your life than perhaps they would if they were constructed for the modern day.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Thank you for bringing that up, Noah.
But religions they're very well suited to adapting, I think, and they have been. Like, Christianity of the first century is, in many ways unrecognizable from the one we have today. And in the future, I certainly don't think religion in general or Christianity will be dying out. I think in the next few centuries we'll see all kinds of changes where it will become, hopefully, more suited to the modern day. But I think, the fact that religions come from the past means it's quite easy to cling on to things which belong in the past. But I think also that in some ways religion is an answer to problems we have today. In a world which is very materialistic, a world where consumerism is rife, I think what religion values, which is, spirituality, something beyond yourself, the idea of, in most cases, equality and compassion, I think that is something that speaks to people. And I think there is a dearth of meaning, an absence of meaning, a void of meaning for a lot of people. And that's sort of filled by things like success and money. And that's always been the case. The Buddha observed that. But I think perhaps religion might have something of a comeback. Maybe not in the same forms as it has had, but I think that's a possibility.
Okay, yeah. I'm quite inclined to agree with you there, Harry. I think obviously religion has changed quite a lot over the last few centuries, and especially in the last few decades, actually, with the rise of atheism and criticism of religion. So it'll be interesting to see how they adapt to that, because I personally cannot see religion going away. Going back to Ted's point earlier, if religion isn't there, people will always turn to some sort of belief. Noah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Belief is useful and necessary, but I would just say, why not shed the baggage that established religion has? If you're advocating for using only certain parts of an ideology, it seems slightly strange to kind of cling on to the label that ties you down to the rest of the stuff that people, I don't know, Christians, Muslims, whatever, admit is bad and backward. I guess there is something to be said for tradition, and people like it, but I don't think that outweighs the benefit that adopting new ideologies that might even say most of the same thing, or at least functionally for individuals might kind of act in the same way, but without the bad stuff that the established religions have as a kind of hangover from the past.
Well, I think the reason people don't want to let go of that is because it still speaks to them, and that the essential ideas, at the very least, still very much resonate with people. People who encounter Christianity, perhaps for the first time, may well find the idea that they are valued, that they are loved unconditionally, is something new to them, that it speaks to them. Buddhism, I think there's a lot there that probably you wouldn't want to shed. The essentials of that resonates with everyone, that suffering is everywhere and that you want to escape that. So I just think that people aren't ready to let go of it because there's still something there that is relevant, that is resonant. And also, you've got the baggage. Yeah, there is a lot of baggage with a lot of religions, but the age of them can also be a benefit, because if you look back into the past, there are all sorts of untapped resources and thinkers who perhaps didn't get much airtime at the time because they were deemed heretics or whatever. But there's wisdom in the past, and people back then were just the same as we are and could be just as clever. And you can even use old resources from the past to reinvigorate a religion.
I think, from my own personal experience, that one of the biggest draws of religion, as opposed to less well-established systems of belief and organizations of belief, is the aesthetic of it. And I think that's not to be underestimated. There's a good reason why, despite not being a Christian by any means, I still, turn up to chamber choir and enjoy going and singing in cathedrals, because independent of the ideology that they're tied to, cathedrals are just really cool. and that kind of sounds frivolous, but I actually think it is really incredibly important. And I guess, I mean, I'm kind of going slightly off topic here, but moving into like modern politics, the sorts of politics that I advocate for have recently it seems to me that they have kind of lost sight of how important aesthetics are, and a lot of the populist movements are a lot better at wielding it. And I think, and a lot of people, kind of look down on appealing to aesthetics and raw emotion as something that's bad. But I just think it's something that is just a tool, and the intent that you're using it with is what matters. So again, religions have it, but if Christianity disappeared, all the cathedrals would still be there. And yeah, I would like to see more something that I would view as more up to date ideologies grabbing the reins of aesthetics a bit more.
I think you're on something there as well about aesthetics, but like what religion does is it creates a narrative. You know your place in that narrative, and I think yeah, that's probably a large part of the appeal. And people become religious for different reasons. Sometimes it's like philosophical arguments, they reason their way into it. But often, I think, people I've spoken to, it speaks to them. It fits with the way they see the world. It makes sense to them.
That's also exactly what right-wing populism does.
Okay, yeah. Emily, did you have anything to add?
I just wanted to add a bit of a proviso to what I was saying earlier about tradition. That I think that while tradition and ritual can be very comforting, and I think that that is at its best one of the best aspects of religion. Noah makes a very good point in that it also has to be flexible. So while religious traditions and rituals can add a framework to life, so for example with things like marriage, and then funerals can add progression to your life that can be useful. It needs to be flexible in moving forward with the times in issues. For example, again, going back to marriage, like with gay marriage or with divorce. So it needs to balance that comfort and the aesthetic, if you like, that goes along with ritual, with an ability to be flexible and move with the times.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there, Emily. I think religion going forward will absolutely need to adapt to the times, but there are elements that will stay for a long time. For example, cathedrals, churches, they are physical testaments to what religious society has given us. Does anyone else have anything else to add to the positives before we move on?
Well, I think in the modern world, something that a lot of people feel very strongly about, me included, is the idea of human rights, equality, those kind of things. And obviously, there's the people who are passionate about those things are not necessarily religious. Many of them aren't. But I don't think you can disregard the connection between insights that have been derived from religion and those things we have now, because it is by no means obvious. And it hasn't always been obvious to the human race that people are equal and that people deserve equal respect and dignity. It's not even been obvious to religious people, as all the religious wars will prove. But the idea that people are worthy of respect, dignity, all of that, and that everyone is equal, that does have, in the West anyway, its root in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think. And you have the same thing in Islam and Buddhism and whatever. And, if you were, a lot of people could probably get to the same conclusion without that. But if people look at humanity from a purely scientific, physicalist perspective, that might not be the conclusion you come to. You might come to the conclusion that people should follow the rule of evolution, a sort of social Darwinian viewpoint. I know not many people do, which is nice. The Nazis were into that. But I think even though religion might not be essential for preserving those institutions and those ideas in the modern day, I think they should be credited with the development of those ideas, which are so important to us now.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point you make there. I think, obviously, time's getting on a bit now. I think we should move on quickly to our final point that we wanted to talk about, and that is, how is religion viewed in the context of the modern world? Obviously, we've dipped into this during our entire arguments. Earlier, we talked about terrorism, for example, and fundamentalist views within different religions. But I was wondering if there was anything else you guys wanted to add about modern views of religion. For example, the criticisms put forward by atheists, or the importance of religion in everyday modern life. Yes, Noah.
You mentioned the criticisms put forward by atheists, and I guess I used to kind of binge Hitchens and Dawkins like most baby atheists seem to do. But more recently, I think the kind of capital A atheists tend to kind of miss the point quite often, and their arguments against fundamentalism and all that sort of stuff are important and worth recognizing, but I think that battle has, I suppose certainly in the societies that we're used to, has largely won, and it's not that useful to try and logic people into not believing in God. It's almost impossible. I've tried it a few times myself. And yeah, I think it's much more useful to engage with religion in terms of its value and what effects it has in the world, as we've been doing in this discussion, rather than do what a lot of kind of, as I say, capital A atheists seem to do, and just pick apart the logic of it, because it's so obviously flawed in that way. But most religious people nowadays are not using it in that way.
Yeah, I think as an atheist myself, I can agree with you there. I think there are positives of religion in modern society. I don't agree with a lot of what Richard Dawkins says. I think a lot of what he says is very, very close-minded. So yeah, I do agree with you there, Emily.
Kind of elaborating a bit on Noah's point, I think, like Noah says, it's not necessarily the right discussion to be having of whether or not religion is true, because I don't think that really affects whether religion is bad or good. Because if you have a religion which preaches something that you think is wrong, so for example, a fundamentalist religion preaching terrorism, I think you would then have to question, if you believe in that God, whether that's a God that you want to follow. And I think it would be difficult. It's difficult to say, well, religion is right or wrong because God doesn't or does not exist. Because I think, to an extent, whether God does or does not exist kind of misses the point, because the point is the pursuit of good. And if God exists but encourages wrong things, then the point of whether or not God exists becomes irrelevant, because you'd still be following the same morality.
I mean, that is largely true. However, I think there is something to be said for questioning the systems of belief that come out with God as the end result. And I know I just said about how trying to persuade people God doesn't exist isn't particularly useful, but the angle I, at the moment, prefer to approach it from is that I think in a lot of ways, I can only really speak to the Christian God because that's the only one I have any real experience with. But you can, without trying to prove or disprove something to anyone, you can try and explain why the concept of God is maybe just not a particularly useful one at all. The Christian God is largely patriarchal. It's a kind of internalized absolute authority figure, or at least if you interpret it fairly literally. And I don't think that is a particularly positive thing for people to have in their heads, regardless of whether or not the being exists or not. Yeah, having that authoritative patriarchal voice in one's head, as some readings of the Bible would encourage you to, I think I think we are past that.
Harry.
I think I agreed more with the first thing that Noah said about, in the interest of tolerance, not going out of your way to be offensive or dismissive is probably the way to go. And I think just having conversations with people, respectful conversations, just trying to explore why people believe what they believe, explaining what you believe, if you believe in a God or not, why you believe it. I think that's a better way to move forward. And often people don't know why they believe what they believe. So that could be a useful exercise for everyone involved. But as for what Noah just said then, I'm probably less inclined to agree with that. Partly because I know a lot of religious people wouldn't see God as a concept or a being, because for them religion is something so personal to them that seems a rather cold, abstract way of framing it. Most Christians I know do talk about a relationship, and I think trying to understand that can be hard. It's hard for me because I'm not sure I can fully relate to that. But I think constructive conversations where you both try to work out where you're coming from and why, is probably the best way forward for everyone. I think society could benefit from more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you there, Harry. I think a lot of this boils down to the teachings of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was, I believe, a German philosopher. And he taught of these things called language games. Harry and Emily, you probably remember about Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein taught that people that believe different things or know about different things, for example, a chess player, has their own language game that they can interact with other, for example, chess players with, and they will understand each other. However, if a footballer tries to talk in the chess player language as a footballer, not understanding it, they won't be able to fully immerse in that language. So I think it's an important point to mention that atheists fundamentally do not understand where religious people are coming from with belief in God. So they do not fully understand and are not fully immersed in that language game. So the helpful way to get around that, I agree with you, Harry, is through constructive dialogue.
But then I think what he said there about, two different communities being unable to understand each other. I know you can still have dialogue, but when you come at it from the assumption that I cannot understand you, I don't know, I think that's a bit unhelpful, because I think you can largely pinpoint exactly where the divergence between you and them has arisen, and I think you can largely understand why someone believes something. So I'm not sure I fully agree with Wittgenstein there. I think because we're all human, we have at least some of the expertise required to understand why people have the beliefs they do.
Okay, but would you argue that it would be helpful, for example, to be fully immersed within a religion and to believe in a religion to understand where someone is coming from?
Of course, and you'll never understand exactly what it's like to be in a religion if you're not in that religion. But I think when it's coming to the basis for beliefs, the why, I do think you can get to the point where you're saying, okay, I understand why you believe that, the reason you have for that, and I do not share the same way of thinking as you. But we know that, we found that difference, and we've both learnt from that.
Okay, yeah, no, that does make sense. Emily, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think an atheist can look at a religious person and see what they believe, and they may not necessarily understand exactly where they're coming from, but what they can understand is what the effects of that belief are. So, for example, if an atheist were to look at a religious person who believes that homosexuality is wrong, they may not be able to understand fully the experience of that religious person and their full relationship with God, and everything that comes into that belief for them and all of the emotions in their religion behind that. But what they will be able to see and understand is, for example, the effects that might have on a person's children who are gay. And so I think it's not necessarily useful to just talk about understanding the religious experience, as it is to talk about understanding the effects of the beliefs.
Okay, yeah, Noah.
On the point about language games, I think there is a danger that you could kind of take from that seeing as people are playing different language games, there is no point trying to reconcile different belief systems with each other, and therefore you give up. And also you could kind of take from that seeing as it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to completely understand an idea you disagree with, I would perhaps argue that in order to understand an idea, you have to agree with it, because if you don't understand something and you're thinking rash, or at least if you don't understand something enough to where you're satisfied, you're not going to believe it. Part of belief is I think is reaching, or at least for me, is reaching a satisfactory level of understanding. I suppose actually just saying that, I'm realizing that I can think of people who don't think in that way, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. But yeah, because people are working with different language games doesn't mean that their ideas can't be compared. And also, different languages allow you to think in different ways. And I'm using languages metaphorically. It's also true literally, but different languages allow you to think in different ways, and some ways of thinking are better than others. If people's language games predispose them to different ways of behaving that can be better or worse than others, and it's stuff like, I mean, Emily was just talking about religious attitudes towards homosexuality, but like in rights movements, so I guess gay rights would be included in that, people developing the language to talk about the problems people are facing and the ways to solve them was instrumental in actually solving the problem. So I've kind of rambled a bit, but I guess what I'm getting at is people shouldn't think that because it's a different language you can't understand it, don't engage with it. I think you can still compare different modes of thought, different language games, and see that some are more useful than others.
I think so too.
Okay, yeah. No, that's a very good point you make there, Noah. Does anyone else have anything to add to the modern context of religion?
We have cut away from the main question bit, although that was all really interesting. But I think one final thing I want to say is that a lot of the problems that we have now, which are related to religion, extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism, that kind of thing, which gives religion a bad name, perhaps rightly so. Those problems are likely, I think, to be solved with more religion rather than less, if you see what I mean. I think it's often going to be that to stop people thinking that suicide bombing is something that is noble and is going to get you to heaven, to stop those ideas taking hold and to stop those ideas being persuasive, you have to come at it from a theological angle. You have to come at it from within the religious community, the Islamic community in that particular circumstance, to explain why is that wrong, because it's so obviously wrong to an atheist. But I think it's theological change or theological argument that is going to be the most important thing in combating those things, because you can't do it with violence, just by killing terrorists. It's not going to get rid of the ideology. It's not going to get rid of the problem, especially with the internet. And I think it's only on a intellectual or theological level that you can start to improve things. So that could be why religion is a force for good, because you need religion to solve the problems that exist in religion.
Yeah, absolutely, Harry. I couldn't agree with you more that you can't solve religious problems outside of religion. However, I wanted to link back to something else you said. You talked about fundamentalism and terrorism in your argument just then, and that brings me on to something that Ted mentioned in his statement to me just before we got recording this podcast today, and that is this. Where people use religion to justify bad actions, their conscience, rather than the religion they believe in, should be considered primarily. However, this does present a problem. If religion is meant to show us how to properly lead our lives, how can it be that it can be twisted so much by so many? Now, I think this is a really interesting point, actually, from Ted. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, he is a practicing Quaker, and Quakers practice pacifism. They are very, very conjoined in that belief. But if you look at Islam, for example, the split between the Sunnis and Shias, that causes a lot of conflict. But also the fundamentalist branches of ISIS and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda using the religion to enforce their very violent ideology on the people there. So I think that's a poignant point to add to what you've just said, Harry. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I really, really strongly disagree with the idea that only religion and theology can act to combat, I don't know what he was, he's toxic religion and theology. I think it would be more accurate to say that ideology should be used to combat that, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to religion and theology on those issues. I think that there are plenty of social, economic, emotional reasons why people would want to join some sort of extremist group, and obviously the route they're going about solving their problems is not a good one, but that's not to say that the problems don't exist, because they definitely do, and the gap needs to be filled, but religion is not the only thing that can fill it. What they're looking for, I think, is a cause to rally behind, and a cause that will get them out of the socioeconomic issues that they're suffering, and religion is not by any means the only thing that can achieve that.
Okay, that's an interesting point to add to that. Emily, did you have anything to say?
I think that Noah is definitely right in quite a lot of that in some cases of religious fundamentalism, it might be useful to look at alternative ideologies where fundamentalism is, for example, a reaction to poverty. But I think in other forms of fundamentalism, so particularly in modern Christian fundamentalism, that largely came about as a reaction to the development of more liberal approaches to the Bible and to the development of more kind of historical approaches to the Bible. And that led people to become much more entrenched in the way that they viewed the Bible and in looking at only the Bible and only certain parts of the Bible with relation to religion. And so I think that's an example of where fundamentalism has come about as a direct result of people feeling that their religion, if you like, is under threat. And I think that there it's not necessarily helpful to use alternative ideologies to religion, because that would just cause people to become more entrenched in their views.
Well, I hope that is not true, because if that is true, then there's nothing you can do about entrenched reactionary. Is it fair to summarize that you're basically talking about reactionary conservatism? I think it spreads more broadly than just religious conservatism, because if it is true that you can't provide an alternate ideology to that, then you're just stuck with an ever-growing population of conservatives, which is not something that I would like to see. And I hope that the right kind of narrative and aesthetic and community being presented to people who fall into those ideologies might be able to turn them around. Like outside of religion, you can find stories of people who are like falling into far right circles on the internet, and what it seems to take to get them out of that is an alternative, more positive ideology being provided. And I'm using the term ideology a lot, and I think a lot of people, especially on the left, tend to shy away from it. But I think I think people who do that are underestimating the extent to which people need it. I mean, we've talked about that a lot, and we've kind of made that presupposition, but I think a lot of people don't. And yeah, people need ideology, and ideology is not a bad thing. It's as you say, you just got to provide those people with bad ideologies with something more positive to latch onto, I think.
I think you're absolutely right there. But I think that in the case of some forms of religious fundamentalism, people might be more likely to be persuaded by an alternative, more positive religious ideology, because it would be less likely to put their backs up than an alternative secular ideology might.
Yeah, I think, just in response to what Noah replied to me earlier, I'd echo what Emma just said. I think on a short-term and pragmatic level, I think I wouldn't say it as limiting yourself to religion, but just recognizing that is probably the most useful and most practical way of combating extremism. It is from within. And also, I wouldn't disagree with what Noah said when he said there are other factors at work when it comes to radicalization. When it comes to Islamic fundamentalism, you have a sense of grievance at Western colonialism, interventionism. Often extremists see themselves as standing up for their people, their own people who've been downtrodden or oppressed. So they see themselves as in the right, which is not good. But I'd say those things, those socioeconomic factors, they are the reason that people turn to these ideologies. That if you were to get rid of those things, you haven't dealt with the ideology itself. You've just dealt with something also important, which is why people might become susceptible to radicalization. But when it comes to actually combating the ideology that killing innocents is good and it can be done in God's name and it is a good thing, when it comes to combating that, I don't think it's sufficient to just deal with socioeconomic factors. It has to be, if it's ideological, it has to be dealt with at an ideological level. And if the ideology happens to be Islam, then I think it's best and most pragmatically solved through the Islamic community. And I think that's what de-radicalization programs, the work that governments do, is almost always rooted within the communities, is to explain why you cannot use those texts that you are using to justify such horrific things, and why it is totally contrary to the spirit and the traditions of Islam to do the things that ISIS and Al-Qaeda does.
Okay, I think we'll take one last point from Noah, and then I think we'll wrap up, okay?
I think I disagree there again. It's very difficult to sustain anger at all. Like you need something to like keep you riled up, and people don't like killing other people fundamentally. Like if you give someone enough resources to live comfortably, they are very unlikely to be inclined to do anything that is harmful, I think. And I would hypothesize that if you remove the socioeconomic factors that drive extremism, the incentive for extremism vanishes because people, like, it's not like a switch gets turned in someone's head and suddenly they're an extremist and forever all they're going to want to do is kill people in the name of their religion. Because once they are comfortable and once they have what they need, like, what is their motivation anymore? But slightly cynically, I think it's somewhat of a trap to think that the ideology is the main problem, and I think it's a diversion that some people make because they don't want to have to deal with the socioeconomic factors that are causing it. So, like, the American government is unlikely to admit how much of a hand they've had in creating the problem of Islamic terrorism. And so it might be tempting to focus on the ideology.
I do agree, but now we're in the situation that we're in. If there had been no colonialism, if there had been no Western intervention, if there had been no crusades, then there might not be the same kind of radicalization, the same kind of extremism that we have now. But now we're in the situation that we're in. The past isn't going to go away, and the steps we might take to improve things, they're not going to be achieved in the short run. In the long run, that might be an aim, to improve the material conditions of people in the Middle East, for instance. But it's not just people in the Middle East who are turning to this. It's people here, people who come from well-off backgrounds. Well, not well-off necessarily, but comfortable. Osama bin Laden came from a wealthy background, I believe. They aren't people who are poor necessarily. They're people who have a sense of grievance and a sense of perhaps a lack of direction. But it isn't just. It can be a bit reductive to put it down to materialism. And I think the ideology, I think it's not easy to combat it, but it's the thing we can do now. I think that is in our power, or maybe not our power, but it's in humanity's power to bring about a change there. Whereas other areas, that might be more challenging.
Okay. I think a poignant point to add to the end of this, just before we finish up, is a quote that I received from Ted, and I really do like this quote. It goes like this: "Religion is like electricity. Electricity can be used to produce light or heat food, but it can also fry a man to death on an electric chair." I think that's a poignant quote to end this on.
That is fantastic, yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and getting involved in today's rather long conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Jake, and please edit out the bits which make us look stupid.
Oh, I will.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Don't you worry.
Yeah, so that's going to be most of
Most.
it.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So that wraps up today's rather long episode of Fixing Ignorance. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation on religion and have taken at least one useful bit of information away from this. We will be recording and releasing 2 episodes a week during the COVID-19 pandemic at 3 p.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, and you can listen to them as they come out on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and all other major streaming platforms. I've been your host, Jake Bonetta. If you want, you can keep up to date with my political shenanigans and this podcast on Twitter @JakeBonetta. See you next time, where we will be looking at another big question with a new collection of voices. Thanks for listening.